Hi, I'm Fedor Master Levy Cherbulenko, and in this series I explore the typical mistakes where people rate it anywhere between 1000 and 2000. This is a first reaction, no engine analysis of a chess.com game played between 1879 versus 1860. Let's start. Alright, so e4, e6, d4, d5. Okay, so the French defense. The downside of this opening typically, unless white takes on d5, is that this bishop on c8 is now blocked. Okay. But here white played ed, the exchange variation. The downside of this for white is that it opens up the bishop, right? And now black could potentially activate it. Although if white plays correctly, maybe they can prevent that. Let's see. Knight f3, developing the knight. Knight f6, black also develops his knight. Bishop d3, developing the bishop, putting it on a good diagonal, preparing the castle, but also preventing black from playing bishop f5. Right? So we cover this square. Now ideally next we also want to play pawn to h3, so that the d3 bishop covers the f5 square and the h3 pawn covers the g4 square, so that we bury this bishop forever. Because otherwise black will just play bishop g4, right? And then they will either, you know, if we then play h3 they can either take, right? Which this knight is better than the bishop, because this knight can potentially go to e5 and be a good central knight versus a bad bishop. So they could just take the knight, and in this case it's a good trade for black. Or they could like keep the pin, play bishop h5, and then eventually they could play bishop to g6 and then trade the bad bishop. Why is it bad? Because again it's on the color of his pawns, right? And it's restricted, especially by this central d5 pawn. And trading it against our good bishop, the d3 bishop, is good. Why? Because especially if you look at the central pawn, d4 is on the dark color, and so it's not restricting the bishop. Okay, so therefore ideally we want to play both bishop d3 and h3. The problem is of course that now it's black's move and black will just play bishop g4 now. Let's see. Bishop d6 he played well. He could have just played bishop g4, right? And now already it's too late. If h3 they can either take or play bishop h5 and then eventually bishop g6. So I think bishop g4 perhaps would be more precise. Yeah, because bishop d6 now white can just play h3. White castled, okay, or they could have played h3. Could have played h3, but castling is okay. Why? Because I guess their idea is that if black now plays bishop g4, there's this well, one idea is rook e1 simply. And it's kind of annoying. I mean, if they go back, it doesn't make any sense. Why play bishop g4 in the first place? And white could just go like, I don't know, knight g5 maybe, right? Attacking the bishop. And if they play bishop e7, that's like passive, right? White now, for example, could play queen to e2. And now black cannot castle, because if black castles, we take on e7. Do you see? So queen e2 is like a prophylactical idea. And basically, if black wanna castle, we have to take. And there's even this idea of gf potentially. So that again, we cannot castle because we just take on e7 or just queen f3, you know. But again, black, like I said, this is a good exchange for black. Good exchange to trade the bishop against the knight. But of course, even though it's like strategically good exchange, it still has one downside, and the downside is that now white has, it's a different type of advantage. Previously the advantage was that black had a bad bishop. Now white's advantage is that although black no longer has a bad bishop, but white has a power of two bishops, and especially the d3 bishop, which now has no counterpart. Previously, although black had a bad bishop, at least they had the potential maybe eventually somehow to trade it against this bishop. But now that they don't have any bishop, right, any light square bishop, now this bishop completely dominates all the light squares because it has no counterpart. So we transformed our advantage into another type. Okay, so it's not also like, it's not so black and white everything, you know. So that's one idea. There's also queen e1, of course. Now why queen e1? With the idea that if now they play the bishop e7, there's like knight e5, and we unpin in this interesting way. Well, I would say rook e1 is like more natural. I'd say rook e1 should be the best. Yeah. So that's why black castled. h3, okay, that's a very good move. Like I was saying, yeah, it prevents bishop g4, so we cannot play neither bishop f5 nor bishop g4. These kind of positions, they are small advantage for white. Nothing crazy, but small advantage. Why? Due to the simple fact that white has the good bishop. If you look at the pawn on d4, not blocking it against black's bad bishop. If you look at the d5 pawn, it's gonna limit the bishop. So this is always small advantage for black. For white. Pawn to h6. Black does the same. Want to prevent bishop g5, yeah? from pinning the knight. Okay, that does make some sense. Okay. Knight to c3. Interesting. Usually in these kind of positions we put the knight on d2. So we play something like, let's say, rook to e1 first, maybe. Put the rook on the e file. Let's say black plays pawn to c6, strengthening the center. Then white plays usually something like knight bd2 and then pawn to c3. That's how they go. Okay, pawn to c3, to strengthen the d4 pawn, and then the queen maybe can go to c2, maybe, let's say, right, forming this diagonal, maybe some check on h7. Then from d2 the knight, it depends. For example, next white could play knight f3 to e5, and then the d2 knight will go to f3, supporting the e5 knight, and then the c1 bishop might go, for example, to f4, right? Then, like I said, we put the queen on c2, and as for the rooks, we can double up them over e5. We can play rook to e2, and then rook h to e1. So this is the whole scheme. Okay, knight on e5, however, knight on f3, queen on c2, doubling the rooks over e file. Something like this. Something like this. Now, normally, again, we just put the bishop on f4 if we can. But here, because the bishop is on d6, we can't. Like, if the bishop was on e7, we would just play bishop f4. But because it's on d6, we have to play knight e5 first, block the bishop, and then bishop f4 eventually. Okay, so that's what usually happens. We put the knight on d2. Now, knight to c3 does have an upside, does have an idea. By the way, a rule of thumb is we usually don't put the queenside knight in front of a pawn. Like, the kingside knight is an exception. It's okay, because we have to castle, and we do not want to move our kingside pawns, because that would open up our king. So kingside knight is fine. But the queenside knight, which usually happens on the c file, usually the rule of thumb is it's not a good idea to put a knight in front of a pawn. Why is that? Because if you just play knight c3, let's say black plays c6, now you have no real pressure against the d5 pawn, right? No real pressure. So it doesn't really make any sense. Like, the knight doesn't have too many moves, right? So it's kind of useless. So the rule of thumb is you should put the queenside knight behind the pawn. So that would be, you would play, for example, in this case, you could play, for example, c4. Let's say black plays c6, and now knight to c3. What's the difference? The difference is that now we have real pressure on the pawn. It's not just knight versus pawn, it's pawn versus pawn. So we are actually threatening to have real pressure because it's pawn versus pawn. Okay, so that's the rule of thumb. Or if you put the knight in front of a pawn, that should be temporary. So that is my point, that the idea of knight c3 here is not to keep it on c3, because again, you do not want to keep a knight in front of a pawn, but it's a temporary stay for a bigger idea. And the idea is, let's say black plays c6 or something, the idea is we want to eventually play knight to e2, and then we want to play bishop to f4. Again, we talked earlier about these bishops, but now we should talk about these bishops. The c1 bishop is white's version, right, of black's bishop on c8 is white's version of a bad bishop. Because again, if you look at the d4 pawn, it's on the same color. Whereas black's d6 bishop is a good bishop, if you look at the d5 pawn. So, also, by the way, it's not just about the bishops. That's one thing. But white want to trade the bad bishop against the good bishop. Because the bishop itself is bad for white and good for black. But it's not just about the bishop. It's also about black's dark squares. Now, because black has all these pawns on light squares, they automatically have squares weak on the opposite side, because these pawns only control light squares. And so, but who guards the dark squares? The bishop. So the rule of thumb, when your opponent has couple pawns on just one color, they have weak opposite colors, it means you should trade their guardian. Usually it's a bishop. You should trade the bishop guardian who guards those weak dark squares. So in this case it's the d6 bishop, so you should play bishop f4. Why? Because if we trade the bishops, then black will have very weak dark squares, like c5, e7, c7, but especially like e5, yeah? And then eventually when you put a piece on e5, like a knight or something, they won't be able to take it. Like, as long as we have a bishop, maybe they can just take your strong knight on e5. But if you don't have a bishop, it will be like a much stronger knight. Okay, so we want to exchange the defender. Let's say we make some move, let's say like this, and also we get this very good square for the knight. Like, this is a pretty good square, you know, for the knight. We can play like queen d2, maybe next something like this, or c3 queen to c2, rook e1, something like this, knight e5. Good square for the knight, you know. So this would be the idea behind knight c3. But we'll see what white played in the game. So actually black did play c6 in the game. Okay, white played, rook e1 white played. Also makes sense, right? Putting it over open file. And maybe white does not want to move the same piece twice. So rook e1 makes sense. As long as eventually, white does want to play knight through e2 and then like bishop f4. Let's see, bishop through e6. I mean, I see, but the bishop, sometimes initial square is even better than, seemingly more active square. I mean, here, knowing what we know, knowing what I showed you, yeah, but this is the idea, but white will end up with another f4. I mean, the bishop just was the point. White will just put huge pressure on the bishop. Huge pressure. It's just gonna be attacked. I think black should have played just something like, I don't know, rook e8 or knight bd7 or something, something like that. But the bishop e6, yeah, I'm not so sure about. Knight 3 5. This is also an idea. I mentioned earlier, right? Just centralize the knight. Also an idea. But again, whatever white does, no matter what white does, eventually white will need to put the knight on f4. Ideally, white should also trade the bishops, right? I said. But they will need a knight on f4. Okay, eventually, because otherwise this knight is completely useless. All right. Let's see. Knight bd7. Pawn to f4, strengthening the knight. This we can call the Pillsbury ring. This kind of formation is called. It's usually with a pawn on e3 as well. It's kind of like a ring, like a ring with a diamond, right? The knight is like a diamond. But it makes sense, this move. Strengthening the knight. Potentially maybe playing f5 by the way, because the bishop is kind of trapped. So it does make sense. The only downside is it weakens this diagonal. So black can maybe exploit it with like queen b6 stuff, right? And pressuring d4. So that's kind of like the downside. It could backfire actually for white. But there's also another idea, by the way. There is one upside potentially in not trading this bishop, and that is if white plays queen f3 and then queen g3, threatening bishop h6. Black cannot really take on e5 because only just go d, right? And then it's like a double attack, right? If you take, you just take, game over. And so, but let's just play some random move. And then like queen g3, for example, yeah? Threatening bishop h6. So in this case, it does make sense to give the bishop c. So strategically, it's good to exchange the bishops because then black would have weak dark squares. But then dynamically and tactically, it does make sense sometimes not to exchange the bishop. So do you see? So in chess, it's not all black and white. There's always, chess is, two things is statics and dynamics. Never just think in terms of just one thing, or just dynamics, just statics. Like sometimes it's one, sometimes it's another, sometimes it's both. So always think about both, right? About statics, but also about dynamics. From a tactical or dynamical point of view, in this case, keeping the bishop also makes sense. And now if black just plays like, let's say, king h8. Now, do you see the bishop on d6 is not guarded because the knight is blocking the queen, is not guarded. It's loose. Therefore, what do we do? Knight f7. Check. Let's say we take queen d6. We won the pawn. And basically, it's just game over. Just, completely winning for white. Okay. So, I like this queen f3 idea. I think I like it more. Because it's piece play. That's another thing, by the way. Well, piece play is more dynamic. Pawn play is not as concrete. Not as concrete, but piece play is more concrete, more contact, more actual threats. So play more piece play, okay? But okay, let's see. f4. Black did play queen b6, okay. Bishop f1. Well, I see. So it opens up the queen, so the queen guards. By the way, white could have just played king h1. Okay, probably this would have been the best. Just king h1. And then if queen d4 check, takes, and then we just queen takes d4. So I think king h1. Because why? Because there's always this threat of takes, and maybe bishop b5 potentially. Who knows? And we can play de because the pawn is pinned, right? So just escaping all this nonsense. Just king h1. Plus bishop f1. I don't like. Why? Because it's a backward move. Like it's not congruent. We just play f4 in order to attack. In order to play f5, by the way. Which the bishop on d3 supports f5, and we have a bishop on e6. But also simply the bishop on d3 is like looking at the king, attacking the king. And now you go f4 aggressively, and now you go back. It's not congruent. You lose the flame. You lose the initiative. Okay? Whereas when you play king h1, yes, it looks like a passive move, but the bishop stays on d3. Or bishop stays on d3, on the active diagonal. And f5 is coming. Okay? So bishop d3, mistake. c5. So black sees that white plays this aggressively, like on the king side, we want to take on the king side. So what's the best counterplay usually? It's aggressive counterplay in the center. In the center. Okay, that's usually the best course. Let's see, so c5, okay. Knight a4, makes sense. Queen b4 is not good. Black should just play queen c7. Queen c7 would be fine. But what is this? b3? This is crazy. Why not just c3? The most logical move. We shank with a pawn on d4. We protect the knight on a4 with the queen, and we attack the the queen. It's the most logical move. Okay, just c3, and then we can like take, for example, right? After the queen moves, the queen is almost shot. We have to go to like a5, which is like a corner square, so not ideal, you know. But yeah, c3 and white would be fine. b3 makes no sense. Yeah, but it just takes. Okay, takes. Bishop b2, attacking the d4 pawn. That makes sense. b5, I mean, that's a mistake. White would just take. Okay, white just takes. Knight to c5. Bishop takes d4. Takes. So white is up. White is up what? So 6 versus what? 5. White is up 1 pawn. Yeah. 1 pawn. That should be enough. Rook to c8, attacking the backward c2 pawn. Pawn to c3 is strengthening it. Knight to e4, that makes sense. Rook to c1, bishop a3 attacking the rook. Rook to c2, bishop f5. Okay, the last moves are not so bad by black. Bishop to c6, white played. Very interesting, very interesting. Attacking the rook, and also attacking the pawn on d5, and then also threatening on f7. So that makes a lot of sense. Of course, there's also this idea of if we are afraid of this bishop, you know, we could just play g4, and after bishop h7, simply play f5, and bury this bishop forever. You know, and then we can worry about bishop c6, bishop d5. This is like very, very safe for white if we worry about the bishop. Okay, so I think this is good as well. But cf6, what? Takes. Yeah, f6 is a mistake. Because now, if what did black? Okay, it's just a mistake. Because if we take the bishop, well, we just move a knight somewhere, let's say here, and we're just up in exchange. I guess black missed, but after fe, well, it doesn't just play bishop e5 and then rook a8. But white plays actually what? Bishop d5 check first. Intermezzo. I believe just resigned, yeah. And now we just take like this way or whatever, or this way and then rook f1. Right? So white is just completely winning. Yeah. Okay, I hope you enjoyed the video. If so, like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.